For example, if there is an investigative report by the journalists in which, as the bad guys, they refer to certain politicians participating in the election campaign or some affiliated to them persons, and one can say that this is campaigning, or is that informing and disseminating social important information? Because now, for example, you can see this highlighted in red, that campaigning can be either for or against a certain candidate, so one can encourage the voters to vote or not to vote for certain participants of the election race. So this encouraging voters to vote or not to vote, if we look at it separately from all the other provisions, we can interpret it in such a way that campaigning is anything we can say, positive or negative, can be interpreted as campaigning for certain subjects. However, we would now see that it is not exactly so, that the election code and the other laws, they have certain criteria. Still, why did we highlight the subjects of the election process? Because of this reference to the subjects, there is a huge number of nuances as regards the use of the campaigning and the time when it comes about. We've already discussed it slightly at the previous webinars, and I believe too that this situation should be legally changed, because this reference, this link to the subjects jointly with the other provisions of the election code creates a situation that is not very clear for many participants of the election. Many of them cannot really understand when should campaigning start, right from the very beginning of the election process on the 5th of September, or since the time when a party declares its participation in the election. So what is the time when this phenomenon emerges? In fact, according to this definition, it starts on the day when finalist subjects emerge and appear, because if we don't have any subjects, then there is nobody we can encourage the voters to vote for. Okay, so the subjects appear not only when the election race starts, but when the CEC registers them. Is that right? Yes, you can see this in this slide. The subjects, they appear, and I think this is illogical again, and it does not mean the interest of the participants and the observers, who sometimes cannot understand when they see a board, for example. Is this campaigning or is that political advertisement? Well, we could see boards back in the summer time and all over the country. Yes, they were there, because again, the legislation does not have a normal kind of a way to regulate these issues related to political advertisement. There are no restrictions for a political party to advertise oneself, to disseminate this advertisement at any time, even when the elections are around the clock, or even when they start. What we see on the screen when the subjects appear. And this process of nominating the candidates, it only starts on the 15th of September, although the election process starts officially on the 5th of September. But based on this logic, there could not have been any campaigning before the 15th of September, because the nomination has not yet started. Moreover, the candidates and the organizations, they become subjects at different points in time. And this can also bring certain possibilities to use those loopholes. On the other hand, it also introduces a bit of chaos into those issues, because a local party organization, for example, appears on the 15th of September, while a candidate can appear on the 24th of September, because it takes them time to get registered by the Territorial Commission. And here there is a third kind of situation. Let's say on the 15th of September, a local party becomes a subject. Campaigning is already there, because one can already encourage the voters to vote either for, but you cannot campaign. because Article 51 of the Election Code allows one to start campaigning on the following day after registration. And since a candidate is nominated and before a candidate is registered, 2 weeks can pass. And the participants of the election race who have not organized it properly or who had problems with registration, who had to resubmit their documents, etc., so they cannot, in fact, during all this time, do any campaigning because it is prohibited. Because if there is no registration, one cannot start campaigning, although you have already become subjects. That's one thing. Okay, how can we qualify then the fact that on TV or in the other media, even before the 5th of September, but at least between the 5th of September until the registration date, we can see many political forces who in fact do their own PR. Well, because many political forces understand that those deficiencies, or let's say peculiarities of our law, so this time of nomination, it starts on the 15th and it can last till the 24th of September. So if I, Kiev City Organization, I would consciously say that this nomination is going to happen on the 23rd of September, and before that I can still have my political advertisement on TV. Now, if we look, for example, at the advertisement that we see on the national channels, there is some of it, not too much, but a lot, and it doesn't have this plaque. It has not been funded from an election fund, and there has been no nomination yet. There is no campaigning. There are no subjects yet. And some other participants of the election race, they have stopped all that on the 5th of September because they thought that the time has started and the election code does not allow to do any campaigning outside of the rules of the election code. So the fair ones would lose. Well, no, but they do not know exactly the law and how to use it. Why I say that here the law should be changed? Because the situation is not very normal, and it contains quite a lot of risks for everyone. Some people don't understand it, other people can use it to get some competitive benefits, and it's not very good when it happens because the provision has been established and formed in that way. In many countries, it is much simpler. For example, we have a stage in the election process or the election stage when the parties have declared their participation in the election. 192 parties said, okay, we will participate in the election. So may the campaigning time start from that date. If they have publicly declared that they're going to participate, fine. Let's have special rules for everyone since that date. And to allow it, we've discussed it with Volodymyr Wenger, to, for example, start publishing, start paying from their party accounts and to pay for this campaigning in a transparent way. Well, but then you can even allow them to launch their election funds since the moment when they submit this declaration. Well, the declarations, they are often made during party congresses. Well, that's what the law says. A party should make its decision at the Congress to say that it's going to participate in the election process. So why not start campaigning on that date? And in fact, all is correctly saying that the election funds could be launched on that date as well. Well, we don't have it. But those issues as to when it starts, that's why I wrote that local party organizations, because there is yet another beautiful thing here. Because, for example, a central party organization is not a subject of the local election. And those subjects that can appear at the local election, that can be a district organization, a regional organization, a city organization in a certain region, they're all autonomous, they're all independent, and each of them is registered separately. They can nominate their candidates, their lists, and then there is a huge number of questions. For example, in the city of Kherson, the city organization of a party has published, its campaigning boards as part of political advertisement. It decided that it would start nominating its candidates on the 20th of September, while the regional organization does it on the 15th of September. Would that be campaigning for the regional organization? Although it's the city organization that is paying for it. And I don't have a clear answer to that. And there can be one more question. Let's say Kyiv. Kyiv is a special administrative status, a legal status, and if this, say, overlaying between the city of Kyiv and Kyiv region, if, for example, it says Kyiv City Organization, go ahead, etc. You can look at the content and you can understand what party this is, and through those criteria try to understand what it is. But if this is just general wording published by the city organization, but the regional organization registers and nominates its candidates earlier, will they gain from it? Well, then it's a question about how the court would interpret it. Well, I think it's the reports that should be made by the police, and I think that their brains would start boiling if they try to understand all that. A party's central organization, if an election has started, it does not mean that a party's central organization should die for 2 months. No, they can also publish their information, pay for it, and then we get back to another peculiarity of the election code. Because, for example, remember, this campaigning, it is linked to the subjects. So what is considered to be campaigning? There is a whole list of what, for example, the election code calls elements of campaigning, like slogans, like the name of the party, and it says name of the party as a subject of the election process. Again, it is linked to it. While with us, it is the local organizations that are subjects of the election process. So let's say if political party Batkivshina or Sluha Narodu, if it puts boards all over the country only saying political party Sluha Narodu, it means that it is not campaigning, because the subject is a Kherson region organ. But that's in fact what we see. The boards, because I have traveled a lot around the country, visiting different regions recently, and you don't see a regional or district organization, you see just the party brand on the boards. Well, the party brand, there are many parties that have already said what their slogans are, their mottos are, and then they put themselves in a certain corner because the mottos and the slogans are elements of campaigning, as the election code says. But if it's just the party name, but it's a central party organization, here within the context of the local election, one can say that this is not campaigning, because the central office, central organization is not a subject of the election process. Yes, they become subjects after registration. So, if I'm a candidate, okay, I've been nominated on the 15th of September by a party. The party has become a subject. Campaigning may start. But I have been nominated but not yet registered. I have paid for my own advertisement, and I can do that as anybody else until I'm registered. That's yet another peculiarity which we all have to understand. And you see, for example, here in this slide, content plus territory, and all those peculiar features as to who becomes a subject where. Within all of the country, in terms of the local election, it creates a complete chaos, and it would be difficult for the observers to understand it too. Because, when those boards finally, with all the information relating it to a party, everything will become clear. But now it's a kind of this provisional interim period, so it's very difficult to say whether something is a violation or not. Well, maybe you can give one or two pieces of advice for the media so that they would not violate it, consciously, the election laws. Well, they have to very clearly understand who has commissioned it, whether a conference has been conducted, for what time, because I've heard that some people, they conclude such general contracts till late September, and in late September it's clear that everyone would be subjects and they would have to pay for it from the election fund. So you just have to monitor who is the commissioner, who has commissioned this advertisement, how long the contract is for, and if this is, for example, a regional party organization, then it can place advertisements only until the date when it has its conference. The day when it has its conference, the media should stop providing services under such a contract and then conclude another contract with the administrator of the election fund and disseminate all these materials as campaigning. But such peculiar features, even starting with the definition, and the other thing is when campaigning starts. Olga, do you have any comments? No, I have just a question. In fact, here it's very difficult for everyone, for the police and for the judiciary, especially with the party organizations and with the fact that most boards that we see have been paid for by the central party organizations, and it means they would be very hard. There is some liability for it, but making one liable and justifying this liability until the time when everyone has been registered and we will see all the information on the boards will be very difficult. Okay, just an illustration to make it clear. If the Central Party Organization has concluded a contract for all of the territory of Ukraine, and usually they would just have the general slogans on their boards or general some kind of a idea for this campaign, so they put them all over Ukraine. The ones who do not want to run any risks, they have concluded such contract to last till the 15th of September, and they have stopped demonstrating this all over Ukraine on the basis of this general rule. Some of them can continue playing, but all of this is done manually and not done in terms of administering it, because they can in fact take off the regions one after another from the list depending on when they have their conferences, and these are local processes. Some people have had their conferences earlier than others, but even in terms of the candidates, they still, in many cases, cannot decide who would go to what council and what lists. And the Central Party, for example, it knows that in the Transcarpathia, they're going to have the conference on the 18th of September. And then they would do everything until the 17th. Others would do it until the 23rd, the 24th. And this is not going to be a violation either. And then, when finally they have the regional election funds, they would replace the wording on the boards with campaigning formula. But such things related to what campaigning is, and I think that linking it to the subjects, relating it to the subject that only appear in the middle of the election process is not correct, because for the first part of the process we do not have any campaigning, and then this campaigning cannot last for 2 weeks, because it's the interim period when you have been nominated but not registered yet, and then you only have 24 days of October for full-fledged, normal, civilized campaigning. Now, the time during which it can last, it starts on the next day after registration, and this provision, we have always had it in this kind of a standard wording. Once a presidential candidate who is now outside of Ukraine, I think it was in 2009, they even managed to breach that provision because they received the registration at the CEC. He came out of the CEC building. there was immediately a stage, and immediately he started campaigning, and he was warned because one can only start campaigning on the following day after registration. Although this is also quite a bizarre provision. If one has been registered, you already become a participant of the election race. You can start your campaigning. It would stop at midnight on Friday, on the day before the election day. Saturday is the day of silence. That's not a novelty. This is all very standard. What is standard, what is not? We already discussed it at the previous webinar, but allow me to say a couple of words. Those two different things, informing and campaigning, unfortunately, in terms of the quality of the law and how it meets the public needs, the social needs. So these are the things that were written in 2008, 2009. They have not yet changed in the election code. I have participated in the work of certain working groups that drafted bills even 2 years ago. In September, the Council of Europe also asked us to submit our proposals. And all those proposals, they evaporate, especially when it deals with campaigning. You propose some new mechanisms, some restrictions perhaps, but then one has a feeling that all the political players really find the current status quo beneficial. For example, there is no word internet in the section on campaigning. There is no social media yet, although we know that the role of those two tools keeps growing with every campaign, and even the campaigns of 2015 and 2019 are very different in terms of the use of digital technologies, internet, and the social media. Okay, speaking about the social media, if a party or a candidate completely comply with the law, meaning with the traditional media, but with the social media, one can start campaigning immediately, and there would be no punishment for that because the law does not regulate that. Well, it is not exactly so. The basic things, they cover the internet and the social media as well, such as it has to be paid from the election funds. And Diana, thank you for this question. Here is, for example, the slide of the proper forms of campaigning. And this comes immediately after the definition. Campaigning can be carried out in any form and by any way, any means that is not prohibited by the laws and the Constitution. So you can do everything, and this is what Olga is going to say. There are no restrictions in the election codes or in other laws. There are, for example, certain requirements about the language in the law on the functioning of the Ukrainian language. However, if there are no bans, no prohibitions, then the campaigning can take up any form, including the internet, because this number of the forms in this slide, you can find it in Article 51 when there is a list, but it is not exhaustive. So these are the traditional forms that one can see in the election laws. This list with time becomes larger because now you can see tents here because many participants of the elections have had problems with tents and now they're part of campaigning in order to avoid conflicts with the local governments. But this list is quite large, you see it now, and it is not a closed list. It does not mean that there may not be any other form. So some fundamental principles, the basic ones related to campaigning and the requirements, they cover the internet as well, such as equal conditions. What does it mean? That an online publication, for example, cannot make one subject of the election process pay 10 hryvnias for a piece of advertisement, while another one would have to pay 20 hryvnias. And that would be a violation of the law, even though internet media are not explicitly referred to here. So we cannot say that it is not regulated at all, the social media, but I think that there should be certain specificity about the internet and on the election code or election legislation in general.
That's basically a play of terms. For you to understand better, campaigning, that's a kind of a term that is characterizing cluster of different forms of campaigning, political advertising, assemblies, debates. These are separate forms. So when we say campaigning, that's whatever it is to campaign for the person. There are some specificities here of the electoral code. I'm going to use the specificities or peculiarities a lot because let's say political advertising for 5 or 7 years I've been talking about the distinction distinction to be made between political advertising and campaigning to avoid confusion. Traditional political advertising stays as the term in our legislation, and it's a very good tool to gain advantages for one subject of the electoral process over the other. Political advertising, let me explain it. It is limited by some things. For instance, marking of political advertising, and this marking that covers 50% of the TV screen is a requirement only to political advertising. And political advertising is just one of the forms that require this kind of bar. Because there are others, for instance, videos, debates, interviews, and if I don't want to have this marking, could negotiate this with the TV channel and make sure that on our contract it's not called political advertising, but it is any other form of campaigning, and I'm paying for this by law, but there is no bar, there is no marking, and the viewer wouldn't understand that it is paid from the campaign coffer, and it's kind of, biased material. So if media outlets do not mark a PR type of an interview with the candidate, they do not violate anything. No, they don't. And it's not a new thing. That's a long-standing, if not a conflict, but just a chance for the TV, including, to bypass the law, because all this should be linked to the definition. So, in other words, whatever you pay for from the electoral fund should be marked. So, but in our case, we use the political advertising term, which is one of the 10 or 12 forms that are established by law. And basically, that's something that the candidate is not covered by, because by definition, that's for political parties only, and that's another restriction that we have there. Experts keep saying that we need to distinguish between political advertising and other forms of campaigning. I would suggest removing it at all. We have political advertising given in the law on advertising, and you can't do anything about that. It resulted in confusion and lots of questions. Olga and I discussed this recently. Language. If it is a feature of a political party, but it's not presented in the form of political advertising as campaigning, but it could fall under the definition of advertising as given by law, then what kind of law we should apply? If on the one hand that's kind of campaigning, on the other hand that's the one that can be defined as pure advertising. So electoral code and the other law have been fully confused due to this definition of political advertising being established under the law on advertising. Who can do that? That's not a simple question to answer for anybody, including the stakeholders, actors involved in the race. So there are two large groups that can campaign. That subjects of the electoral law and citizens, given all the restrictions, if it comes to media outlets, so the campaigning rather should be based on the contracts. About citizens, as you see, the citizens are entitled to freely discuss the campaign manifestos of the candidates, the manifestos of the parties, the qualities, and campaign for candidates and organizations. Traditional question here, it's not so much about campaigning. That's a broader issue that is about lack of definition of things like headquarters in the legislation. So administrative side of the election campaign, that is really impressive, with consultants, lots of people, those who are called frontliners, etc. So how would you remunerate these people, and, under what law? Legislation doesn't have anything on that, and usually it's done kind of, in the form of envelope payments in cash, and it's all due to lack of definition. The same about those people who hand out leaflets standing by the respective political party tent. Can you pay these people for doing this? I believe that if it is done from the campaign cover, if it is based on the agreement, then contrary to the law on presidential elections where it was clearly banned, at the moment we don't have this clear ban, so the campaigners can be paid for this if that's done from the electoral fund. That's my personal position, but again, it's questionable. There is Article 160 of the Criminal Code that provides for criminal liability for the combination of money and campaigning. Well, if it is an agreement on providing campaigning services, not just campaigning per se, well, let's go back to last year discussion. If you remember, the CAC provided the explanation that was subject to appeal. The CAC said that, okay, on the basis of the law of voluntary activity, you can remunerate the field workers, the campaigners, for travel affair and communication from the campaign coffers. Well, it was criticized, and they were accused of legalizing bribery because, this could be just a loophole to be used to cover kind of, bribe, and Olga was quite right to add that you can also you pay cash. At the presidential elections, it was direct ban to pay persons for campaigning. At the moment, this restriction is not there, but the question remains. And to my knowledge, the headquarters that organize campaigning itself don't know what to do with that, because on the one hand, there is a simple question. Well, you have to pay people for the work they are doing, and it doesn't matter what kind of work they are doing, whether they sell ice cream or they hand out the leaflets and you walk half a town, literally. But if you pay it by law or legally, then you can face administrative or criminal liability. And the law doesn't provide a direct question how to do that lawfully. Well, people can do it free of charge. But there is a question here. So you can campaign for somebody, but you can't use your money or the money of the third party to do that. And in some countries, there is a minimum that can be spent for this. For instance, I want to publish leaflets. Well, yeah, so let's say I have this urgent desire. Well, it is based on my interest. Well, there is a specific case of the European Court, Bowman versus the UK, Kvitsyn versus Poland, a similar judgment, but in the UK case, the applicant, Miss Bowman, was charged because she exceeded the requirement. It was 5 or 10 pounds by law that the person could spend for campaigning materials. She exceeded this sum and she was charged, and the European Court ruled that it was wrong because Miss Bowman analyzed parties' manifestos on specific issue, and this leaflet she was just saying, you need to support this one rather than this one, because I guess it was an environmental issue, because this party was supportive of this and the other was not. That was her personal stance, it was her personal position, and at the previous webinar we were saying that we need as much information as possible on the candidates and manifestos. We had a question about the age. It was presidential elections. The person produced leaflets on his own, and the guy was arrested, but the court ruled that it wasn't campaigning and the person was allowed to print these leaflets on his own printer and hand them out. But there is a question about that, indeed. Because there are two things here. Either you campaign free of charge, but if you want to disseminate something, hand some leaflets out, then it should be paid from the electoral fund. In Lviv Oblast, under the name of the NGOs, the colored newspaper was handed out. It was expensive print, and it was allegedly produced by people, and allegedly that was done in the support of a candidate they liked. As to printing, in the effective electoral legislation, this provision was appearing, disappearing, but it stays. That's the provision that allows to produce printed campaigning materials using your own equipment. And recently there was a question, and the answer was given as per law, namely, the person actually called and said, okay, if I am a candidate at home, I have a industrial type of equipment, the equipment that can produce almost professional leaflets. And the answer was, okay, so if that's your own equipment, then there are no restrictions. What about initial data? Instead of publishing house, you write, okay, so it was produced using the equipment of the candidate or participant of the race. So there are lots of open questions, and Olga was quite right to point out that there is one position, I can have a different position, and there is no clear answer, and we can't provide this clear answer, and that's wrong, because some people would hesitate to do that, some others will do that, and if it comes to remuneration, the campaigners, a lot of this is in the gray zone, and a lot of people don't know how to make sure that they do it by law. At the end of the day, it results in misstatements or off statements, and people as well as NGOs don't know what are the accurate numbers, and they can only assume how much money was spent for campaigning and what was the electoral fund. Another important thing here for me, as well as for journalists, that's distinction between information and campaigning. Because, as I have already mentioned, for this time we had 5-6 requests to explain whether we can analyze campaign manifestos or not. Opora commented on Article 57 that bans analysis, assessment of political parties' manifestos by journalists. What about criticism and, let's say, monitoring? Ludmila Preshko said that information about programs or manifestos and publication of the manifestos of the participants of the race is part of the information provision, so that's informing rather than campaigning. And if journalists or publishing house, let's say editorial, decided to analyze the manifestos of the main candidates, the same format, they just compare the manifestos. That's a very important information for the voter to start with. So this type of a ban is very strange, and that's in conflict with other provisions of the Electoral Code. As I said, definition of campaigning is very broad, but the law contains clear-cut criteria as to what is not campaigning. That's the section on informing and section on special information provided. And in the slide you see that. Just that's the criteria that are in information section, then it means it's not campaigning. So everything that deals with the general information, special information, or informing, and that includes facts and events of the election campaigning. And here journalists can and should speak about what's going on when it comes to election campaigning. At the previous webinar we said that there are some rules as to informing. It should be conducted impartially, accurately, and in an unbiased manner. Only then we can say that it is informing or covering elections rather than campaigning. The same debates, radio and TV debates, that's within the category of informing, but that's just the special ones. Because at the previous webinar I said that debates could be qualified as campaigning, and we had wider discussions in 2019, at the stadium and then at the stadium. It was the following format. We had two candidates, and using their own money, they organized debates, and that was part of campaigning. There are debates as the way of informing, but there is a set of criteria to comply with to fall into this category. The equal timing, the same format, the turns distributed in terms of the introductory remarks made, publishing the results of exit polls, social surveys, interactive surveys, that's within informing, but there are their own criteria there. I'm not going to cover them today. We spoke about this at the previous webinar. You can have access to it if you want to. So what else is not covered by campaigning, though it is abused, especially incumbent officials who have advantages over those who are running? That's official statements. In 2019, we remember this, and when conducting monitoring, we discovered that prime ministers, let's say, came to the meetings to launch roads. The members of the parliament and councillors went to the markets to see how everything is organized there. So the official coverage is there, and it has been abused in our country. Well, that's kind of traditional scene, traditional provisions. There is nothing new there. They keep abusing it now because when you discovered through the monitoring, ongoing monitoring, we can say that at the local level there are some mayors that are running at the upcoming elections again, and we see that they allegedly do their everyday work, and this work is covered by media outlets, but this activity got more intense given upcoming elections. We'll talk about responsibility or liability a little bit later. Olga will cover that, but the issue here is this official coverage and official informing is to meet certain requirements, and very often it is violated. It should be just a visit of a prime minister and launching a new road build. This should be linked to the official duties that he or she performs. If that's the head of Rayon and the Oblast administration, it meets with the agribusiness somewhere, and it takes 2 or 3 minutes of coverage. Well, so that's his job, basically. But why do we do that? Because when you analyze that and take a broader look, so and establish the fact of violation, so that's the job of a violator. Violator is missing de facto, de jure. This should be TV and radio committee, but that's ridiculous. Well, yeah, proportionality is subject to be covered by their monitoring as well. For TV and radio, that's the Council on TV and Radio Broadcasting, but the experience of 2019 proves that, okay, they refer to low quality of legislation. That's true. That's one of the factors. It's a very bad quality legislation on this particular matter for the regulator. But at least they could have issued warnings, but even that is missing. Again, warning is a warning. And respectively, there is no practical experience that would analyze and break down, let's say, informing whether they meet the requirements or not. Because in reality, they often don't. They follow the simplest scenario. If I go somewhere, and it could be just campaigning tour, and it's covered as the visit of head of the Oblast administration, as the councillor or leader of the community, and they normally start being very active in terms of these tours, visits, etc., just given the elections. And that's an advantage of them versus others. Goal. I have the criteria what's campaigning, what's informing, how to distinct the two. Campaigning is conducted to encourage to vote for or against, and informing theoretically is conducted to pursue the goal to provide access of the voter to a diverse, objective, unbiased information necessary to make informed and free choice. Given back to the questions raised by the journalists recently, one of them was, can we interview, and that was the question from regional media outlet, can we interview candidates that are of interest to us, for instance, war veterans? Just to ask them, why are they going to run? Why did they decide to go to and become politicians? My answer was, why not, if that's the same format, and they're going to be representatives of the key political players, or these are just well-known people at this local level, then you are doing this not to campaign for the person. Well, it will all depend on the questions as well, and whether that would look like advertising, or the journalist is asking just to learn more factual information. Very often the anchors say, well, you know what, I like you a lot, and they do say this when they interview a person. Well, that's a violation of journalist standards, because the journalist should be above the discussion and not to show any preferences, especially if these are candidates. But for some reason, journalists have some kind of fears when they read some provisions, or they take these provisions out of the context, and we know that campaigning, that means using slogans and mottos. They read this and they take everything as campaigning, and if it is an interview and we write that he's a candidate, well, should we skip the name of the political party? Well, I don't want this to be campaigning. Well, see, they misinterpret this. So it's very important to see what was the purpose of all this. And publicly important information, and we'll speak about this later. But these criteria are very important to distinguish between campaigning and informing, because if that's a visit of a councillor or the leader of the party in 2019 to the market, open air market in Oblast Center, she was walking around, talking to shop assistants, and that was a feature of 2 minutes. I don't know whether it was publicly significant. Again, opening kindergartens, launching new roads. Somebody was just driving around on the crop harvest. Well, that's a very good example, actually, when the leader, one of the leaders, a woman political leader, and there was a feature at the national channel when she was driving the crop harvester for 2 minutes. Okay, so the purpose, informing and campaigning for this or the other candidate or against somebody. So that's what is clearly stated by the code, using the symbols, logos, mottos of the party, informing about the support of the party or the candidate at different entertaining events, and attracting attention to the party at different events. When it comes to informing, we spoke about that at the previous webinar. You can see that it should be unbiased, balanced, accurate, complete in terms of informing, and that's very important to develop, to produce different information materials, whether these are articles or features on TV. But based on these criteria, we are distinguishing between informing and campaigning. The question about these symbols, that's a very important one. It doesn't really matter what political party it is, but they have an assembly, and the journalist is just covering this assembly. That's just coverage. The journalist doesn't want to campaign for this political party, but to have it visualized coverage, you need some pictures, and there are some symbols there. What do we do then? From my perspective, here we need to have a very good, strong regulator with the respective powers. We have respective legislation, and it is subject to heated debates yet, that provides the establishment of co-regulatory authority when the industry, online publications, publishing house, and editorials unite in organizations, and jointly with the National Council they develop different documents, including the Code of Conducts. And Code of Conducts would clarify the restrictions, because you're quite right, Diana, to point out that if you read it formally, then it means that you can't show the flag of the party at the party congress on the news. And some TV channels hesitate to do that because they are in a position and they don't want to do that, and some, on the contrary, show 3 minutes of this Congress with the focus on the symbols. That's the other side of the story. So the Congress could be shown differently. It could be news type of a format, 10-15 seconds, and if it is a weekly news program, they just show everybody who had congresses. Let's say in the course of this week, it was this and that who had these congresses. And we know we are in the midst of campaigning, that's okay. But sometimes it's just a 2-minute feature about one party. And we have an example of that. At the previous webinar, I quoted this example. The party, let's say, for everything good that we'll have tomorrow, has a feature on the national channel, and it was the morning program, 2-minute feature about the Congress of the party with the speech of the leader, with some other comments, etc. Then I turn the news program on, prime time news program, another 2 minute feature about the same party. Well, we don't show anything about any other party, nothing about their congresses or about the election process or campaigning, but it was specifically about one specific party with the programs of 3 or 4 representatives. So that's an abuse.
Практика.
However, if the regulator was good, and especially if we had co-regulation, we should also understand that in terms of legal legislative work, you can't write all this thing down, that the tone should be neutral or positive. You can't have all of this in the law. The law should contain some basic things, but it's thanks to the practice of the application of the law that should fill in this either by the regulator or the co-regulator. Unfortunately, we don't have this co-regulation. Yet, as to the slogans and mottos, this is also something that needs to be approved. Because in terms of legal certainty, what is a slogan? What is a motto? Symbols, that's more or less clear. They should be registered with a party. Logos, okay, that's... Recently I analyzed some peculiar features of it, and it turned out that certain party logos are registered as brands, as trademarks. But in fact, such a registration of this party trademark in terms of political advertisement doesn't have any sense, because it's not a product, it's not a service. So this symbol can be protected legally if you're producing pens or notebooks, but if we're talking about political advertisement, this is not the use of this slogan, of this symbol in the understanding of the law. Well, usually the codes there, they usually code they correctly because they also work with patent lawyers. Okay, so this is anyway, it should not be a trademark because it's not a product or a service. Yet another slide with criteria for distinction. Well, here we talked about debates and which is part of information, exit polls, and the posters to be funded by the national budget. On the left side, you see direct requests or encouragement to vote for or against political advertisement. All of it should be done through the paid from the election funds within the legally established periods of time, and it's banned in foreign media. One of the basic criteria to distinguish between informing and campaigning is the presence or absence of public interest. Now, if we analyze a report or an article, cannot understand, or we do understand that the objective, the focus of it is to make somebody interested rather than to disseminate publicly significant information. That's the main criteria, thanks to which we can say that a report or a publication is a part of campaigning and not advertisement. We have Article 29 of the law Ukraine on information, and even in the national law there are those criteria. They're quite broad, and basically lawyers and experts who analyze it can use them to apply them in their work. And you would see that during the elections, the most popular one is a possible intention to confuse or to fool the public. And in fact, that term was used by the European Court of Human Rights in one of the cases, Rochefort versus France. Well, it was not about the elections, but the judgment said that during some processes, that the intention was to fool the voters, but it's hard to prove it. Well, for example, we said it at the previous webinar that we often are short of serious analytical materials. Maybe with time it can change. But if we had such important and profound analytical very materials, we would be able to find such things. For example, by the candidates who would try to hide certain periods from their biographies, or there have been several times where wrong information was registered. So this is all how this information can be called publicly informant. And this list is again not exhaustive, and it ends up with very important words for the lawyers. It says, and others. And that's what the European Court always does. It analyzes in every case whether there is public interest, because it's very difficult to write it down in general, because there can be public interest on the level of a certain community, or on the level of a country or several countries. So it's impossible to write it all down in the law. But this is a kind of a list that can be used in different situations. And this is a kind of a matrix slide that can also be used for analysis and the distinction between informing and campaigning, using for basic things. What is the information about, whether there is any public importance, who is it about, the status of a candidate, what is the context? Well, as to the context, it's the easiest period of time for the media, because the election campaign context is already publicly important. And as we said it at the previous webinar, even according to the international standards, it requires the highest possible standard for dissemination of any information during the election period. And how this has been covered, identification of the characters, only positively or negatively, whether the coverage is balanced. So this can be used in practical work if you have any doubts, or if you plan to broadcast a report and you have some doubts about whether someone may believe that this is campaigning. So you can use all those criteria in order to analyze some material, some publication, or to use it for yourself to know whether you're dealing with campaigning or information. And that's the last slide from my part. As to the special mode for the media, that's also quite an important thing, because the voters get most information from the media. And this year, for example, I haven't seen such studies, but last year TV still was number one, accounting for 70+% in terms of its impact upon the audience. Although the internet keeps developing, it has almost, killed printed press, and it starts taking away the ratings, the audience, and the money from TV as well. Last year there was a study where we could see that the internet was ranked number 2 in terms of the budget, in terms of the advertisement amount, after TV. So it is mostly through the media that the voters get their information. So for the media, there should be special guarantees, safeguards on the national and international level. What are those guarantees about? That the government should not interfere with editorial independence, that it is possible to publish hot discussions, that not only the content but the form is protected, that the information should circulate freely, and the government should take necessary measures to effectively protect the journalists and other media employees and their promises. Well, clearly, journalists should not be beaten at any time, but especially during the election period, and that's what the recommendations of the Council of Europe focus on. They say that such situations should be quickly investigated by the government and effectively so that the media would not apply self-censorship and provide as much information to the voters as possible. There are some special conditions for the media, special requirements to the poll results. Let me emphasize it here that there are certain novelties in the election code. One of them is important. They now are now those who commission the polls and the media, they have to publish information about who commissioned it. Because in the previous election laws, we had a kind of a situation that those people who would conduct the polls, they did not have this obligation. That's why at the press conferences they would say what the results are without mentioning who has commissioned it. While for the media, they said, okay, look, we're just broadcasting it, and we do not know who it has been commissioned by. So there was a gap. Now this gap has been taken away, and now if there is a poll without naming who has commissioned it, that is a breach, either by those who have conducted the press conference, or if the media has not published this information, that it's a breach by the media. Special requirement for political advertisement or campaigning, it should be paid from the special election funds. We've discussed it today. The right of response or reply, it's a special right during the election period. I don't know whether you paid attention to it, but now you can see that with lots of different features in the law. Because, in fact, those who deal with media cases, who protect the media in the courts, they see how inadequate that part of Article 57 is, because it is written here as a negation, but the right to reply, it's a different thing, because you provide your own comment, while in the other case, the information would be deemed unreliable, and the right of response or reply should be implemented, carried out very quickly, within 3 days. And during 3 days, you will not be able to say whether any information is not authentic, because it's a special process in the court. It would last for a long time, because there would be all kinds of evidence to prove its authenticity or not to prove its veracity. But the right of reply should be unconditional in the election period. If I believe that there is some information about which I should provide my comment, then they should give me this right. Well, this is on condition that it is about a specific party or candidate. Well, as regards the day of silence, unfortunately, the Internet would often violate it, providing fair conditions for all the subjects. That's also a whole number of principles where, for example, one cannot reject a candidate who wants to conclude a contract. There's a whole set of obligations for the media compared to normal time, to peacetime, if we can say, to provide fair conditions to all the subjects of the election process. And if there is a coverage, it should be fair, well-balanced, and unbiased. Remember, there are 5 very clear grounds as regards the full nature of information. Balanced information should be unbiased, etc. So we see that the media have certain additional guarantees to be protected, but they also have a whole number of additional obligations during the election process, which is related to their role and their status, and the need to provide authentic and as much full, good information to the voter, and it should be properly labeled, but we have already discussed that. So that's all I wanted to say about it in terms of campaigning, as to how to differentiate it from information and the special modes for the media. And now we have 2 very important subjects. That's about the restrictions during campaigning and liability, because some people forget about that. Well, it's not that they forget about that, but it's very hard to make people liable in view of everything we have already said. Now, any example here, even for example, as regards the websites of the uh, official websites of the government authorities. For example, if there is a coverage of the activities of the, let's say, governor, but then nobody mentions that he's also a candidate. So it is a breach, but it's not very clear who should be made liable, and it's not very clear what is campaigning here, what is the encouragement, or and who should provide this expert assessment. So even remembering about liability, we often face such situations. We at the Pora, we would see that there are some elements of a violation. Only the court, of course, can say whether it is a real violation. But very often, when we apply and report about that to the law enforcement, there is no response, but we cannot even criticize them because the mechanism has not been well defined. All right, we will not be able to discuss everything, but at least we'll try to speak about the main restrictions as to what kind of liability can be found in the laws. Although it does not mean that all those persons would be held liable. And there are some special features there as well. Yes, special features as to the range of persons. Well, first of all, there is foreigners, people without citizenship, including journalists, and it also says how this participation exactly is banned, like participating in all sorts of concerts, sports events, any other public events. But even if we analyze the previous campaigns, quite well-known ones, we would know that one can avoid that. For example, a well-known political party that now has its faction in the parliament, and a band, and one of the candidates was a member of that band. They had their concerts, and we know that they had foreigners as the artists participating in that band. That's why any events carried out with participation of that band, they would be legally broken down into two parts, when during the first part, when the candidates were presented and introduced, was commissioned by the administrator of the election fund, while the second part had been commissioned by those people who organized the concert tours. And although there was only 1 minute pause in between those two parts, but it was very hard even for us to claim a violation. We just had to write that there are certain elements or features of violations. Another situation, I'm talking about the journalist, a well-known TV host or a well-known journalist. In the nighttime, he comes to a campaigning concert of a certain political force and starts campaigning for that force. And he says, well, I'm not doing it during my working hours. I'm doing it outside, in my free time. I can do whatever I want. Well, this is most of the ban for the foreigners or people without citizenship. So if this is this kind of a person, that this provision should cover this person, because it basically can be applied to any foreigner or a stateless person. The government authorities, the local governments, the law enforcement authorities, and the courts, and also civil servants during their working hours, except for the candidates. And here there's a whole range of events and stories and who can do it, who cannot do campaigning. So we see it has been written, the executive authorities. Although if it's a ministry, then a minister is a political position, so that means that that restriction should not apply to the minister. But we already have a minister who's going to be a candidate in one of the regions. Yes, in Odessa, number 1. What should be done? Well, it's an issue we have with this wording, because the previous laws just said that there was a ban for the public officials to participate in campaigning, and now it says during their working hours, except for a situation when this person is a candidate. If this person is a candidate, one can always do campaigning during their working hours as well. This is the first time we see such a wording, although it means that at the time when this person is performing one's work with the taxpayers' money, then legally and lawfully one can do campaigning. So for a certain part of the briefing we talk about important thing. No, there is another ban that can be found in other parts of the article. Well, I won't have it in this slide, although we should mention it, that this is the ban to use working meetings or even office equipment to do that if it's a kind of a meeting that has been paid for with the taxpayers' money, with participation of the press service. But the very fact, what does it say? Means that if I am a governor of a regional administration registered as a candidate, instead of 9 o'clock, where I am supposed to have a meeting with my officers, I can walk door to door and do campaigning. Well, it's absurd, because in fact it should have said that they are allowed to do their campaigning outside of one's working hours. Well, I even remember that there was a period of time when they were supposed and in fact forced to go away on vacation, but that provision was then reformulated, and no one forces persons to go on vacation, but the current wording is really absurd. So now people can completely dedicate oneself to the election campaign while continuing to get one's civil servant's pay. But even if we're not talking about the candidate himself or herself, but other public officials, like a deputy minister, for example, or any civil servant, any public official, who's not even a candidate, but can do campaigning for a certain political force. And we would see that the issue of one's working hours is very vague. We can imagine, for example, an event taking place, and for example, the floor would not be given to that public official, would not be given, and then 6 p.m., and that immediately turns the situation over. One's working hours are over according to one's working schedule, and one can start campaigning. Well, unless this has been organized with the taxpayers' money, then we cannot really say that this is a violation of the campaigning rules. And that's a very widespread story where we would see this kind of campaigning, where this person was in one's office in the morning, and at the lunchtime one went out to the central square, had a briefing, and then did some advertising. We launched a request, and it turned out that after lunch one took half a day away, so this is not a part of the working hours. And we understand that had it not been for our request, this person would not have launched a formal request to take half a day off. But again, it's very difficult to prove something, and again, we cannot hold this person liable, because how can we separate the working hours from non-working hours, and how can we monitor whether a person has officially taken half a day off? When was that request made? Members of the election commissions, again, that's a specific wording, while performing the obligations of the members of the election commissions during the time when they carry out their obligations. We used to have a different wording when it was not allowed for the commission members. Now one can think that this can only be the case when a commission member is participating at a meeting or is performing any other work directly inside the election commission. Although we still believe that this person has taken the oath of a commission member once office period has started, and until it is over, this person would take this position and cannot participate in campaigning. Although it's also a question about legislative work and how it has been formulated. And as we said, media people in their reports and publications, except for the ones that has been paid from an election fund as campaigning. Perhaps they wanted to avert advertorials in that way. So it's difficult to understand what the legislators had in mind. However, this provision could lead to a whole range of problems. Of course, it would have been much better to do it in the way that we had in the previous version, for example, to ban candidates from hosting TV programs, because that's a classical way to avoid certain bans when we have a candidate who is talking on the air every week and speaks there for 3 or 4 hours every week, and this has not been paid by an election fund. It has not been labeled or marked in any way, although clearly this person gets a lot of benefits in view of one's visibility that other candidates would not have. Now, as to the time frame restrictions, we have that provision here that has already been cited today, that a campaigning is allowed after the election commission makes a decision on registering a candidate. And that means that for political parties, since the time it is nominated till the time it is registered, if any campaigning is done, then this is a violation of this article, and one can then speak about administrative liability, however, with all the nuances we have mentioned. So in most cases, the police should be able to read the contract, who it has been commissioned or requested by. I think police may have problems to this kind of information as to who has carried out the Congress where certain candidates were nominated. We would recommend, for example, to work together with the territorial election commissions, and if one gets information from a political party saying that there is a Congress taking place, should inform the police. But we understand that the territorial election commission must not do that. They don't have such a competence, they don't have such a mechanism. It will all depend on the local situation. But the TECs, they usually don't have their websites. They can have it, but they would not publish this information anywhere, and getting free access to it for a policeman, for example, police officer. Well, some of them have Facebook pages. Well, Facebook pages, yes, but there would still be a question about how can a police officer get this information about nomination of a candidate, and how authentic it is, and what one has to write in the report about administrative proceedings, because we're talking about the need to document these events. If we remember the latest election campaign of about 1,000 administrative cases that went to the court, 1/3 of them ended up with being closed down because it was too late. It was after the period of 3 months has expired, then another one-third ended up with those materials sent back, and there was legally no time to finalize them if the protocols had already been drawn. And in the law, you can't find this procedure to send materials back for completion. Well, in very few cases, they were able to.
Вважають,
Corrected, and a lot of lawyers believe that to bring to liability, that's a theoretical matter. Due to procedural deficiencies and conflicting institutions, so practically, if you want to apply it, then it becomes very difficult. And for instance, serving the protocol, it involves a lot of nuances there too. So it just doesn't work. If we recognize that the organization violated, it was not to place this advertising, it has elements of campaigning. So the law enforcement representative from Rivne, where this guy should go to find the respective person and to be able to serve the protocol on him. Well, they should go to the city of Kyiv to find the headquarters, but the code doesn't say anything about it. So that's kind of a procedural matter, like in-house instruction, and I'm not sure that it's going to be accepted by court to assess. And while sometimes police refuses to search for people, well, there are lots of nuances when it comes to administrative liability, and it due to this, it is turned into theory rather than practice. Though there are attempts that are made to bring it to court. Successful cases on contributions when they are seized, and that's this issue worth 150,000, and tax debt. The person failed to pay taxes, didn't pay 10 kopecks and was supposed to, so that's considered to be a tax debt. The case is filed, and while the evidence is there, that's our practice. That's what we spoke about, and you see the picture of the board that was put there between the 5th sentence of September with the name of the political force, saying that, okay, so that was this political party that put out the board to explain the position. It's not campaigning and cannot be disseminated. Well, that's exactly what was written on the board. Yeah, that's the information copied from the board. And then to stress the position, they write the data about the commissioner, about the number of copies, but who would read that? Well, there is the reference to who did that, and well, if there are some complaints, they would say, you know what, that's on the board, and that's political advertising that has nothing to do with the party that is nominating its candidates. Restrictions as to the forms and means of campaigning. What is banned is campaigning that contains incitement to change constitutional order, undermines sovereignty and security. These things are hard to assess normally. This incitement are normally not direct, and for police it's very difficult to establish who would be an expert to assess that, and that's the police officer on duty who is to establish whether there is a sign of incitement to secession, for instance, or it's missing. And we understand that if it is a criminal case, then there is a forensic assessment and analysis. They are pretty expensive, and If that's refuting information, then again, that's a different procedure. So in administrative proceedings, well, the restriction is there, limitation is there in electoral code, but how to prove that that's exactly what was meant, and how to prove that it was secession. Well, or for instance, interesting propaganda or war propaganda, that's difficult to prove. Can these cases, if it happens, be heard outside elections? That's exactly what happens. There is the provision on administrative offenses, and it allows for 3 months since the um moment the protocol was issued, or since the moment it was identified, committed, etc. Speaking about this particular restriction and citement and about sovereignty, etc., some of the aspects could be qualified under criminal code, and then it is subject to investigation within the criminal case with all the forensic analysis that Olga already mentioned. So indeed, there is a chance to face criminal liability. It is banned to disseminate the unlawful information about the candidate, then the right to response, though it is framed as refuting, and what is knowingly false information, because in the previous legislation it was the information that was false that was established by court. In the effective legislation, this was eliminated, but knowingly false or wrong information, does that mean it? Do you know any instances when the person was charged for knowingly untrue information? That's a civil disputes mainly on refuting information. As to the cases where it was administrative liability imposed, I can't recall any. It's easier and more logical to prove this in civil proceedings. Well, you need to prove intent. Well, just then that would mean that the person knew it was false information, but knowing that, I disseminated it. That's why they go through refuting it under civil proceedings, or violation of order and dignity in civil case. Well, you can prove that it was violation of your honor and dignity. Well, it might take you around 2 years. Well, it's a complex process, might take longer. But knowingly a false information, that's kind of, dead provision, if you wish. And there is a problem with the right to response when you submit this statement. If that's kind of, refuting, then you have a feature published and you have to refute information, you can do that. But in this case, you have to prove that somebody knowingly wanted to disseminate false information about you. The right to response, why is it an important tool to have? Unfortunately, it has some issues with legal technicalities, but in the previous campaign, when we had a very good civilized definition of the right to response, there are recommendations of the Council of Europe, there are international standards as to the right of the person to response, and it's very important. Why? Because this mechanism of the right to response should make media outlets engaged in black PR more reasonable. If it is a well-written mechanism, that's a faster tool. You can get the same possibilities as media outlets for free to refute the information they published. And starting 2014 or 15, we had several successful stories. Well, media did want to resort to the right, but under summary procedures, the courts did that. Administrative courts were very effective then, and what I'm saying is that, well, I encourage subjects of the electoral process to actively use this mechanism, because if you look at this broadly, then it can improve the standards. Well, media outlets should stay balanced and interview the ones they criticize, etc. Yeah, we spoke about the balance coverage. Can we bring to account for this? The provisions are clear, they are in the law on advertising, and that's part of campaigning, which is covering political advertising as one of the forms, and the dilemma that we've had is whether in the course of campaigning we can use the state symbols, violent scenes, arms, etc. So at the moment that's something that has a clear answer to, because political advertising is covered by the law on advertising. All restrictions with respect to advertising cover political advertising that in the course of campaign is deemed to be campaigning. Though there are some nuances, what shall we do with the candidate, whether that's going to be justification or not, we spoke about this already. And who is to charge, whether that's going to be an element of violation of campaigning under Article 210. Can it be police? There is a special authority in charge of the protection of the consumer rights. I can't remember the full title. Anyway, that's a designated authority to protect the rights of consumers. So we repeatedly went to this authority, and in the previous election campaigns, while the legislation was controversial then, and they said, well, a voter is not a consumer. So in these instances, there is no consumer. Nothing is consumed. That's a very archaic definition, because we do have a consumer, that's a consumer of information. Clearly, that's the authority that just is reluctant to do anything. In the previous campaign, when we went to it, we spoke about the campaign of the incumbent president then. So naturally, they didn't want to do anything about that. So, and even now, they are reluctant to undertake any measures. But we'll keep referring to it, and we'll say that, okay, so they do not respond, and we'll try to do something about it. Just a couple of words to add, given the reluctance. In hindsight, there is one story. Previously, the powers to handle complaints on campaigning were vested with the CC, who has always been reluctant to do that. And when in 2012 this power was taken away from them, they just thank God we are not in charge of that, because you need to be an expert in that. All the things that we are talking about, well, that's something that requires systemic and broad vision. Maybe it's not only about elections, but it seems to me in our country we don't have media expertise developed that would be admitted in courts, valued everywhere. We have kind of separate self-regulatory authorities, but their opinion is not always considered. But we don't have any official kind of media experts that would provide their opinion in different disputes. Do we have the pool of them? We have a clear-cut procedure on the advertising with the signs of sexism. Well, it has clear procedure. The authority goes to organization that can provide an opinion about absence or presence of these elements, and the courts take that into account. And we have a huge issue with the electoral legislation. Who is to assess and make an opinion on the hidden campaigning? It cannot be just a police officer. So he wouldn't be able to take one word and take it into account the color the word is written on, take it as campaigning. Well, on media outlets, it should be a regulator, let's say national council. But talking about other forms, there should be some kind of a designated authority who would judge that, because the campaigning is not only about media outlets. Well, basically, we are talking about outdoor types of advertising, because that's mainly in the focus. So who would be an expert to judge on that? Police keep calling me and ask, okay, what would be the authority? I don't know. I don't see any mechanism here. It should be established by the law. So an organization cannot write an opinion stating or claiming that there are signs of hidden campaigning, and you would submit it to court, and the court would accept it as admissible because it's not governed by law, and that would violate the procedure, and it would be questionable and to the respective organization who did that. Violation of the requirement as to the use of the state language. Campaigning is to be in the state language, though the issue here is that the provision is written in the manner that it is just an enumeration of the types of campaigning. They are kind of broad ones, but well, they sort of are the ones that require the use of the state language. And that results in the set of issues. I can't remember the name of the law. Well, the law on the language, for short. That's Article 18 that talks about campaigning materials, the language of campaigning, something like that. And there is a set of systemic issues, because if you sort of don't talk about the specificities of the word, and there are some other serious things there. When the law was passed, it contained a lot of references to the law on minorities or indigenous people. And in Ukraine, we don't have any legislation. There is a framework, a law of 1990 on national minorities that doesn't contain any specificity, nothing to say about election campaign. So we have a serious law to preserve the state language, but the mechanism is missing, and that results in a set of issues, just of practical nature. For instance, in the Bessarabia and Transcarpathian region, and in other regions where there is a densely populated indigenous people or national minorities that traditionally speak and disseminate information in their language, then we can say that they are deprived of a chance to, let's say, not to violate the Article 18. So there is a paragraph there saying that it can be done in the language of national minorities with information dubbed into Ukrainian. But how to do that properly? How dubbing should look like? Would it be font 40 in the regional language, and then respective font for the state language? I mean, details are missing. We spoke about this with Olga, and I spoke about this at the webinar as well. Very often we have harsh laws, but they are not mandatory to abide, though. And Article 116 provides for a clear-cut mechanism as to handling complaints and a violation of the language law requirements. We've got the commissioner and the procedure, so The provision is there, but article of the Code on Administrative Offences that the Commissioner is to apply comes into effect in 1922. Please note that. And we have rules of procedure. We have the designated authority commissioner, but there is no sanctioning mechanism that is effective now. So how can the authority be effective if this authority doesn't have any sanctioning powers? Well, it can work similarly to the National Council on TV and Radio Broadcasting. Well, they can issue reports, they can do something else. National Council of Radio and TV Broadcasting, I don't know whether it is respected or feared of, but when I talked to some of the colleagues that was about advertising, they said, well, wow, you know what, state language only. We don't use any other language. We translate even the names of the stores, unless it is a trade mark or brand. Newspapers, online materials, and companion materials of the subjects. Here, the Commissioner is empowered to monitor that. The Commissioner can resort to sanctions, but the provision is missing. So, can police charge it under the Article 210, 212 and 10? It doesn't say electoral laws in this article. It says are the laws. So, well, they can try, but the scope, I mean, the number of violations when it comes to campaigning potentially can be huge. Will they be able to cope? Another new thing, and I talked to the regulator National Council on that. They confirmed that they developed a special procedure on the sign language. So campaigning materials on TV should be mandatorily accompanied by the sign language or subtitles, and the National Council is going to monitor that at these elections. Limitations as to the place of campaigning materials. It is not allowed to put it on architectural sites and in the places that would impede traffic. Under different laws it was stated, and the law on the elections of the councillors, it was added that it was not only architectural sites but cultural heritage, and then we have different gradation here: national, central, regional, etc. Levels. After adoption of the electoral code that was supposed to govern these issues, at least not to deteriorate the situation, we have returned to the provision that used to be in the law on the election of the president, where it was only architectural sites mentioned. If that's, for instance, in the park, then we can speak about the violation of the rules of public order and well-being. And we have some examples. If you have time for that, we'll show them to you. The general principle, though, is that village, town, and city councils are to define the places where campaigning materials can be placed. And there are issues there, since some councils adopted these provisions back in 2012, and irrespective of what is written in electoral laws, they stick to the same places. For instance, in Lutsk, among all the sites where it is allowed to have campaigning materials, they identified the public transport bus stops, and that's directly banned under electoral code. We had examples whereby the leaders or the mayors were brought to administrative liability because they issued some orders that would violate the mandatory rules. I don't understand why we have these restrictions. We had protocols issued at the previous campaigns, outdoor advertising at the bus station, and that's the station in communal ownership. So just a classical, typical type of advertising that got stuck to the premises of the station. Well, it's just the way the provision that is phrased. Well, yeah, bus stops and stations, or public transport stops rather. When it comes to the national campaigning, the candidates, well, they might have one counter agent that would cover 3,000 of this space. So the person, the entity that placed it was kind of, brought to account because, he was not aware of all the details of legislation. Yeah. Well, but the restriction is there, and it covers the metro stations, but those who use metro, saw some materials, but it wasn't campaigning because we didn't have the candidate, but we had the references to the political parties and even the names, but it was before. So these provisions are really outdated. They are obsolete, and we need to look at them from the point of view of their reasonableness. When it comes to exit polls, that's clear. You can't disseminate it because that would be an influence on the voter who haven't made his choice yet. So the same about sociological research because that might have an influence on the voter. So some restrictions are kind of reasonable. They are justifiable. If that what's public damage caused by this prohibition, and what would be the use of charging of bringing to account? Let's say when it comes to metro, naturally there is a lot of space there for advertising. So why would you ban campaigning if the role of campaigning is to bring some information to the voter? So if that's a director of utility company that is a candidate running now, then he shouldn't contribute to this. So we are talking about level playing fields. Well, the same as here, when on the door of a public transport vehicle, you have campaigning materials. Any public damage caused by that, when the taxi driver has a picture of a favorite candidate and keeps it in the car, I don't know. Well, the ban is there, but whether it's reasonable, that's an interesting matter, and we can go back to the same issue after the elections. Another interesting thing, on the premises of the authorities and state authorities and the one in communal ownership, and here we have lots of examples and cases. For instance, somebody came to the utility management office, left in the hall 50 leaflets. So should we bring to account the head of this utility company or not? What was he supposed to do to avoid this? When it comes to communal ownership, there are lots of things here. If it is a small village and there is one club in communal ownership there, and there is no any other place for the assemblies. No, we are talking about campaigning materials. So the club can be leased. The code allows for that. But what we cannot do is just to put this type of a board. There is kind of, serious rationale behind it. restrictions in terms of funding. Campaigning should be conducted exclusively out of the electoral fund, but well, there is also liability established for that. These cases are within an ACP, how an ACP would monitor unlawful campaigning all over Ukraine, and that includes production of campaigning materials, and it should be a report on that, how to monitor whether the number of copies was 5,000, as it was established in the report on the use of electoral fund, but in fact it was a lot more, because we saw that it was several thousand in one village. How would it make 5,000 all over Ukraine? But how would you prove that? And again, at the moment we have this prohibition and we have a liability, but we can't bring to account due to lack of mechanism. It was a curious situation with the reports, because from the very beginning it was stated that the report should be sent to an ACP, and then ACP was crossed out and it was said electoral commissions, but they can't have any expertise to verify these reports. What they might do with the reports, they would accept them and put them in the cardboard. In July, an ACP was there again, but at the moment it's not clear whether that's going to be TEC jointly with an ACP or who. Well, so they have the right to monitor, but they don't receive the report physically, because to do that we need to submit it electronically, similar to the reports of the political parties. And there, well, using similar procedure, we should have the reports on the campaigning submitting. At least that would allow for some monitoring, but how an ACP would identify any violation in a village by a candidate, and how would that be reflected on their reports, and if it is reflected, how would they match it? Restrictions in media, we spoke about that. We have a definition of hidden campaigning, and here we see that it can be established because you have a logo of a political party, but who is to establish this for the police or in the police to establish that it is a logo and it is a violation? As we said, there is no subject who would do that. Liability. Well, that's just a linked matter. Well, no candidates, there is no marking, but well, when it comes to advertising, there are some requirements as to marking in the law on advertising. Apparently, that's personal opinions that are expressed, our interviews, etc. And that's traditional violation of the law on advertising, because the law on advertising establishes that it should be marked as advertising or similar to advertising. Nothing else exists there.
Right. They are just saying it was simply an interview with an interesting person. It can be called media's own initiative as well. Sometimes within the election process, it can look like that, and there can be an asterisk or a little star, and then somewhere on the last page one can read that this asterisk means that this report has the status of advertisement, and it should not be done like that. The reader should understand it at once, rather than trying to understand what kind of symbols are used by a media outlet, so nobody would understand the real status of it. So, as we see, the liability is not too high, and holding one liable, well, the fine is between 1,700 and 3,400 hryvnias. Well, that's quite a high level of fine. Well, there are fines of 170 hryvnias. Right, 170. This is where we're talking about violating the standards of proper balance. Now, for example, the violation of the rules of uh, services and amenities, that's mostly about the tents. Clearly, if one has put up a tent somewhere, then one would not take it away in the night time. And for example, when one talks about the tents, according to the law on urban development, it's a form of small architecture, and it should be kind of coordinated with the local authorities. So usually when a tent is set up, the candidates should inform the authorities that they would put their tents somewhere. I would not do that. There has been a very interesting judgment in Kharkiv. There have been lots of discussions in 2009 and 2010, and a party submitted to Kharkiv City Council the list of all their locations where they would set up tents, and 2 days later they received a court ban, saying that it would lead to conflicts, to tension. So I would not even inform the authorities. Well, still, it's an issue putting them up without a permission or without information. One can say that this is an allowed form of campaigning. Well, if that's just a small tent and it does not interfere with the traffic, well, clearly, if this is such a large structure, a large tent, then there should be a kind of a permission or an approval of the city council. We have said that even municipal premises can be leased, but for example, if it had been rented out to one candidate for 2 hryvnias, then the condition should be the same for all the other candidates. And there is also an article about that in the Code of Administrative Liability. It's not very popular, but still there can several court decisions can be found about that. That's one of the articles that would be the easiest one to apply for the law enforcement when a candidate has already been registered, when an election fund has been launched, when some boards have been placed out in the streets, but there is no information as it who has published it, who has commissioned it, and as I said, of all such complaints, about 1/3 of them, those who placed the boards were held liable, although we see again that the fines here are very low. And there have been very many cases where the amount of the fines was lower than the court fee that one had to pay. Well, it was not a fee, but it was a kind of a duty that one had to pay if one was held liable. And that's a strange situation when the amount of court fees is higher than the fine one has to pay. That's very similar to those COVID-related cases. If we're reading a decision and we see that the person who has placed those boards has agreed that there was a violation, that there would be no fine and one would not be held liable. So we understand that this case law is quite controversial too. Now, the provision about the contributions, what the central party organization could be held liable for if they have placed those campaigning materials at the time when the subject of the election process has already been nominated. This can be interpreted as them campaigning for them, that it has not been paid from the election fund, and that this is a kind of an indirect contribution that has not passed the election fund, but supported by other entities. Well, there may be all sorts of problems. For example, the region has nominated, according to the election code, all the levels can nominate their candidates. And the question is, can one have all of the team in one post, or let's say a city mayor and the district and the regional candidates? And if it is so, whose election fund should pay for it? Because remember, they're all autonomous entities, they all have their different elections, and these are different election funds. And if the mayor pays for this poster, that means that in terms of all the other candidates, the mayor is paying for somebody else's election campaign, which is a breach. And again, here it's the National Agency for Corruption Prevention should draw such protocols. No, here we have Article 1591 in the Criminal Code. If you fund somebody else for the amount of 50,000 plus, then you can be held criminally liable. Right, this should be calculated well. So this campaigning could be somehow separated, because it's not very clear whether those cases will be investigated till the end. But the law on the local election, which we have had in 2015 during one campaign period, there was a good provision saying that the ones who nominated, the nominating body can fund all those subjects. And if there is one organization that nominates all the candidates, then with their election fund, they can pay for everybody else. Right. There can be a link to the nominating body, and that would remove at least some of those problems. A very interesting example could be found at a store where the store owner was a member of a political party, and they were selling their plastic bags with the price of 1 hryvnia. It was not, a dumped price. However, there are certain regulations, and here one can say again that this was a kind of an indirect contribution by the store owner or the candidate, because there was no vote buyout. There was no attempt to bribe the voters, because the price was not lowered artificially, but it was the use of political advertisement. And when that party would have registered candidates, then the sales of such plastic bags would definitely be a violation. But again, the question is whether there would be liability for it. And now we're passing to one of the most controversial provisions, which is bribery. If this is direct bribery, then there would be criminal liability only. We will talk about that at our next webinar. If it's indirect bribery, which is getting illicit benefits, which is followed by or accompanied by campaigning, or by mentioning a candidate, or even mentioning the name of the political party or its symbols or logo. And with this provision we have certain problems, because if we look at the definition of this unlawful gain, then this is Article 63 of the Criminal Code. Well, this is over 63 hryvnias, the cost of a product or service, or if we're talking about foodstuffs or alcohol of any cost, then it entails criminal liability. Yesterday, we had our Transcarpathian coordinator saying that a party wanted to give out bohrach, which is a kind of traditional soup. And we even said that such ready foodstuffs are also mentioned in the product classifier as foodstuffs. So in that situation, we have the elements of Article 160 of the Criminal Code.
The question here is the following: out of the foodstuff that is handed out should not contain any companion materials that are produced out of the electoral fund. There was an idea not to abuse of this and sort of give cell phones as gifts or any other expensive stuff. So there should be some restrictions, and the draft law contained the value of 63 hryvnia and 6 kopecks, shouldn't exceed that. However, after completion, they just copied it from the criminal code just to have similarity, and we can't have the identical definition because we don't know what untaxed minimum is. It was imposed by the Cabinet of Ministers under the tax law. It was 17 hryvnia. After adoption of the law on the income tax, then it was given the definition, but there was a conflict because all legislation that had existed before uses untaxed income, and how would that match the new tax law? And it was decided that to distinguish criminal and administrative liability, for instance, robbery and if you talk about the criminal misdemeanor criminal code, that's considered as the taxed social benefit, so that's half of the minimum subsistence level, and when we can calculate that, so we have 63 hryvnia. But when we look at the sanctions, whether administrative or criminal, or any other laws, then untaxed minimum is still 17 hryvnia. And if it is 6% from 17 hryvnia, it doesn't make 63 hryvnia, it makes 1 hryvnia. And 1 hryvnia, 02 kopecks, and CC explained on indirect bribery. We always said that it was a formal explanation. It's just a copy from the code and doesn't explain everything. Now, this explanation was an attempt to explain, though it is contrary to the tax law, and there is an issue here when it comes to its application. So, given and accepting that explanation, we can say that administrative and criminal liability is not delineated there. They well, since it should be administrative when it doesn't exceed 63, they keep talking about 63 hryvnia only. In simple words, CSC allowed to produce gifts with the value not exceeding 63, though the tax code and the electoral code say that it should be 1 hryvnia, 02 kopecks. They authorize that, and a lot of people will do that, producing materials worth 63 hryvnia, and the police will say, you know, we have tax code and a different vision. And, so the courts are not going to be governed by the CSC explanation because it's contrary to law. The CSC had to delineate goods and companion materials and say that if it is information type of material, so leaflet, then it's companion. If that's some goods that could be reused, for instance, the calendar or a pen that could be used for other purposes as well, then it should be 1 hryvnia. Unfortunately, this explanation is missing, and we have things that would result in problems in practice. and explanation made it even worse. When it comes to indirect bribery, I think we'll have a chance to discuss this at the webinar. We've exceeded the time, yeah, we got carried away. It's a very complex discussion on campaigning that we are having today. That's why we got carried away so much. To conclude, let me thank our experts, Alexander and Olga. Let me thank our interpreters into English and into the sign language for being with us, and thank you for helping us with explaining this very complex issue. You'll be able to watch all the webinars. They will be openly accessible on the Human Rights Platform Council of Europe project on Facebook and YouTube. So you can go back to our webinars, view them again, just to get useful recommendations and advice for all and many stakeholders of this political process. Thank you very much and all the best. Thank you. Bye.